Hello and welcome to Unstress, where each week we try and unpack another piece of the puzzle we call our modern life. I'm Dr Ron Ehrlich. Obesity, high fat, low carb, fasting, confusing health messages. Just a taste of what we're going to be talking about today. When it comes to public health messages, who better to talk to than a professor of public health? My guest today is Professor Grant Schofield from the Auckland University of Technology. He's director of the university's Human Potential Centre. His research and teaching interests are in well-being and chronic disease prevention, a theme I'm sure you can all relate to. And his focus is on reducing the risk and eventual mortality and morbidity from obesity, cardiovascular disease, and diabetes. Grant's motto, which I first heard about 5 years ago when I interviewed him on my old podcast, is be the best you can be. Now, when I first heard that, it really resonated with me and I've appropriated that for my own life ever since. I hope you enjoyed this conversation I had with Professor Grant Schofield. Welcome to the show, Grant.
Oh, hi, Ron. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Grant, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but firstly I wanted to know, how does one grow up to be a professor of public health?
Well, that's a great question, and I've often wondered that myself, because you don't sort of walk around in your childhood while everyone else is aspiring to be policemen and firemen going, I'll be a professor of public health. But I think, just in the accidental sense, I was always a kid who was good at science, and that was about all I was good at until I stopped trying at school and became mediocre. So I enrolled in engineering, which lasted about 2 weeks, and then I just ended up doing a series of degrees in physiology and psychology because they seemed interesting. And then I couldn't think of a job, so I thought, well, I should be a psychologist, and which turns out to be a hopeless profession, at least for me, because my tendency is to want to do the opposite of what you should do in psychology training, which is shut up and listen. And when the solution becomes obvious, not to offer that at all, but help people get to the solution. And my natural tendency is to go straight for the solution, which I think is good for science, but hopeless for psychologists. So that's, I just ended up in this space, and I've always enjoyed fitness and exercise and thinking about what we eat. And then those just turned out to be the two major public health problems of our time. So that was just lucky. Well, not lucky. It's bad luck for humans, but it's good luck for me.
No. Let's let our listener be the judge of that at the end of this podcast. But the solution-driven approach, of course, does lend itself, you would think, to public health, but it's not always as simple as that either, is it? Really?
No, because even when the things like with this, current, especially the nutrition stuff, the obesity stuff, we're still stuck in this sort of old thinking, which I think was never driven by science, which is, and you think, most listeners, I think, in your show will be well past this, that it's just not about calories, that nutrients affect us in such complex ways, and calories aren't created equal, and not only that, they affect people differently because of our insulin resistance, and, we all vary between ourselves on our insulin resistance, and then even within ourselves, you have a stressful day, a poor night's sleep, all of a sudden the same meal has a profoundly different effect. That's well known. Easy hypothesis to test, shown to be true. Yet to get that to change how we talk about food and think about, something like the weight problems we have as a society and all the other downstream diseases, is more complicated than you'd think. So, and then you have to sort of, I better not tell the whole truth about the science. I better be moderate about it. Otherwise, people won't take me seriously in a policy environment. And that's, I find that ridiculous.
Well, I think this does beg that very important question, because people who listen to public health messages coming out of health organisations that you would respect, and the government wouldn't be a small part of that, you'd be excused for thinking that this was the latest and the greatest science put to our benefit. But it's not as simple as that. Why are public health messages so confusing?
Well, I think there's three things going on, Ron. The first thing is, medicine in public health, no exception to this, to all parts of medicine, has always taken a long time to move between evidence and actual change. and I think a classic is going back a long way when the British Navy did an actual randomised trial where they put limes on boats and noticed they could reduce the death rate by scurvy by half of sailors in the Navy, and it only took them another 150 years to get that into practice. So, that we've always suffered pain points and taken a long time to move. The second thing is the argument in public health is you're good enough telling the whole truth because the people you want to help the most might find that too hard to deal with. So, the physical activity guidelines, I think, are a great example of that. It's like, 30 minutes of anything, just go gardening a day is where you need to get to for your health. And it's absolutely true that will help you, but in my opinion, that bar's wildly low for the extra benefits of being fit and active can confer on you. So we take ages to move, we set the bar low, and then thirdly, we have vested interests all over the place. And now I've been working partially for the government in Wellington, and you'll be just amazed that people are shamelessly going, "Oh yeah, my job, I'm a professional lobbyist, and I'm for hire, and I just come and do my bidding." And I can't imagine how you could deal with that as your job and sleep well at night, but people seem to shamelessly do that. So there's that influence, and once you take into big food and the drug companies and the sorts of people who will employ those lobbyists, we're a long way from keeping things simple. And a great example of that at the moment is in Australia and New Zealand, they're looking at redoing this food labelling thing. We had the star rating system, which is just nonsense.
Yep.
And one thing, in my opinion, you could do is just you could avoid packaged food for a start. But if you're going to look at packaged food, the percent of sugar in it, not just added sugars, but all sugar, and displaying it on the front in teaspoons, would be awesome.
Yep.
But then you've got lobbyists going, no, it's added sugars and this and every confusing permutation. So there's groups out there that are deliberately trying to confuse you, and so that's where science doesn't meet policy.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme on this podcast, and it won't come as a surprise to our listeners because while it is a story that's easy to miss, once you hear it, it's difficult to ignore.
Yeah, exactly.
But I find that empowering, don't you? I mean, on a personal level, and maybe not on a community level here, but on a personal level, what's your, when you hear that, I just kind of think, well, you've just got to take control of your own health, haven't you?
Oh, absolutely. And for all the woes of social media and fake news, it's allowed the internet and what it brings with it. It's allowed a whole group of the community to do exactly that and do their own work and become the advocates. I still think I'm still very positive about that, and I see that just growing and growing and growing. And I think in health, medicine will eventually catch up where the public get to, and maybe that's the way it's going to always happen. And maybe that's a good thing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's get on to some of these health issues, because one of the things that's another common theme that seems to have run through a lot, doesn't matter what I'm talking to people about, cancer, heart disease, autoimmune, obviously diabetes, insulin seems to be the key. I mean, the lower the better. What do you think?
Well, I think insulin's important, but I think when you just go just insulin, it's actually, I reckon there's several hunger hormones that regulate our metabolism, and they all may be affected by the same and similar things. Insulin's the main crucial one, because if you're insulin resistant and you over-secrete insulin, no matter what, you've got a problem. The idea of hyperinsulinemia is the sort of 2 decades worth of metabolic problems before you present to the doctor, and the doctor says, "Oh, you're just pre-diabetes, we'll just keep an eye on you." Well, that's you're not pre anything at that point, in my opinion. And then you look across high insulin, hyperinsulinemia, and cancer. There's certainly going to be a pro-growth environment. You look at cardiovascular disease, there's certainly an inflammatory environment for the formation of atherosclerosis. So that there's obviously stroke as well, and then the sort of vascular problems in the brain like dementia and whatnot. Yeah, all related. But I think again, it could possibly oversimplify the problem. There's a second hormone, glucagon, which should work in tandem with insulin.
Say that again, glucagon.
Glucagon. So
yep.
that gets sent to the liver, and it's sort of the opposite. So when insulin's up, glucagon should be down because you want to dispose of the sugar in your blood, and glucagon will tell the liver to stop producing sugar. And that works in a lot of people, but then we see in type 2 diabetics that's dysregulated as well. So you've got high insulin and that's up. So not only have you got high insulin, but you're pumping out glucose. So there's a second hormone that you need to understand. And I think the other two hormones that no one really talks about they're called the incretin hormones. And it's just an interesting effect called the incretin effect. And let me just describe this.
Yeah, well, just spell it for me. Incretin.
Incretin for intestine secreted. Incretin. Incretin.
Okay.
And the incretin effect is, well, I ask you, Ron, to drink 70 grams of glucose, glucose tolerance test, and I measure, obviously, the glucose goes up in your blood, and then the insulin goes way up in your blood. What's interesting, though, is if I intravenously feed that glucose into your blood, obviously, it's the same amount of glucose going in, so the glucose goes up, but the insulin response is much, much different. And that's called the incretin effect. And what you see is that in the small intestine, if carbohydrate goes in near the top of the small intestine, which is where processed acellular carbohydrates go in, then you get the same response. You get your glucose response, and you get a high insulin response. If the carbohydrates go in further down, where cellular plant fully protected by their plant cell carbohydrates go in, then you get the incretin effect. You don't get the insulin going up nearly as much, even though it's the exact same amount of carbohydrate. And I think people tend to go carbs, but in their cellular form, it's just worth thinking that there's another whole pattern of the way. And we keep thinking it's just plant fiber, it's the fiber, it's the indigestible fiber, it's the microbes, but actually just the cell structure being intact in the first place is interesting. So there's just a whole swag of hormones that are related to and around insulin, and you get different effects under different contexts, and it's just worth, it's the whole thing in science. We said, the calories out, it's too simple.
Yeah,
it's not describing the situation. Go, it's insulin, and then you go, well,
that's a bit too simple.
Might be too simple as well. What's this? And then it's hard to know when to stop with the biochemistry because it's an endless rabbit hole. But
yeah, and
those ones are important.
We also hear about leptin as being.
Leptin. We've got about leptin. So leptin, of course, being the really interesting idea that you would have ghrelin, which is related to stomach stretch. It goes down when your stomach fills up and goes to the hypothalamus and says you're full. And at the same time, leptin might be secreted by your fat cells as food comes into the system and go to the same part of the hypothalamus and say you're full. So they will work in tandem. But we know that leptin is very easily dysregulated by high insulin itself and inflammation and probably other things we don't quite understand. So there's your other two.
I mean, these public health messages that we've been hearing, and again, I know my listeners will be very familiar with this, but the low fat idea kind of almost sets us up for a dysregulation in these hormones, doesn't it?
Oh, totally does. So the people most prone to benefit from a whole food, low carbohydrate diet have been told to do the opposite of that, which is, I actually hope now even the most ardent low fat supporter, food pyramid supporter would go, we got that wrong, because if you start feeding someone who's insulin resistant and had a lifelong battle with their weight, if you start feeding them processed carbohydrate and low fat, you're going to have the sorts of metabolic problems that haunt our countries. So, it's really no surprise in many ways, is it?
But I've often said that if we think that, and you mentioned the long lag time between evidence and actual coming to reality, and 150 years to convince someone to eat a lemon is hardly a complex idea. And yet it took 150 years, and there's an awful lot of money to be made from this low fat, let's lower the cholesterol, let's get on statins as well. This is not going to be an argument that's going to roll over easily and go, oh, gee, you know what, I was wrong. I really should have been telling you. It's not going to happen.
Well, it could, in another sense, because you can imagine the British sailors on those first ships in the randomised trial, all of a sudden they started, a couple of them started blogging about it, and they put it on their Facebook.
Yes, of course, in a bottle.
Then the Royal Navy tried to cover it up, but they had left by then, so they put it on Instagram as well, and all of a sudden a movement started about fruit on ships.
Yeah.
So the world is different, and I'm forever optimistic about that. The other thing in public health is that you're always asked to be optimistic. Yes, we can solve the obesity epidemic. Yes, we can do that. Yes, we can do anything. When it's clearly obvious that, at some point we can't. But I am optimistic that the public can drive a change here.
Yeah. No, I am too. And I think we were talking about this before that we started, and saying that another popular theme, I think, is the acceptance that the change has to come from the ground up, from individuals. Yeah. And that's what's happening. Yeah. And I agree with you. I'm an optimist as well. So, good on us. Let's hope everyone is too. Now, here's another thing that I wanted to ask you, because, we've got very preoccupied with lessons from the past, from a kind of ancestral diet. What have we evolved to have to eat, and how far have we strayed from it? But there was one aspect of our ancestral journey that I think we've kind of ignored, and you've actually just written a book about it, and that is this idea of scarcity, of embracing hunger, of fasting. And you've written this book called
What the Fast? Yeah,
What the Fast.
It's been interesting. I mean, as an actual lover of eating food, to me, it's a surprise to me that I've really got into this so much and embraced the idea of fasting. I've learnt a lot, and discovered that not eating occasionally for food lovers is actually possibly one of the best things you can do, because it makes you enjoy your food even more. If you took me back even 5 years on, and you talked about writing about fasting and being into this, and I think I would have just laughed at you. I just would have gone, what are you talking about? But we have, and What the Fast has been a real, because when you have to start writing about this, you do, or at least I do, I go back to all the original research and think about the biology, and it's really, I think, the last 5 years, talk about science catching up with the human conditions. I think most religions have known that. I think virtually every religion has some form of fasting in it, and I'm not sure it gets you any closer to God, but I think it probably makes you feel good. So that's been an interesting thing, and we've just recently discovered that actually, if you don't eat, then you drive a bunch of catabolic processes, non-growth, tidying up, spring cleaning for the lay word, that are incredibly useful for human health and longevity. And I think the one thing that really convinces me is, so there's a bunch of animal work on longevity and caloric restriction, not eating, or severely reducing calories. And you can do these. They do these studies with animals, and you can triple the life of a very small animal like a nematode worm, or get a 50% increase in a mammal if you severely restrict their calories. The trouble with that method is that you end up having an organism that's cold, constantly hungry, depressed and irritable, has a low sex drive. I think that's about it. But they,
well, as a public health message, Grant, I don't think that's going to sell. I think we may have to reframe the benefits there somewhat.
Yeah. But the reality is that you can hack that system and get the exact same biological processes with these compressed eating windows and occasional fasts, rather than just long-term calorie restriction, which much more appeals to me. And that's really what I think, Victor Longo and these sorts of scientists, he's in San Diego, have unpacked both in animal and human models, is that restricted eating windows and driving yourself into a state of nutritional ketosis on a regular but not always basis is highly beneficial to the human condition. So he talks about fasting mimicking diets. In our what the fast, we prefer to go, hey, look, here's some behavioural techniques that I think would work to drive you, into a bit of nutritional ketosis every week, and allow you to drop out of it as the sort of ebbs and flow of the 7-day week comes and goes. So that's, sort of ended up going, well, look, if I was, we've played around with this a fair bit now in our lab and with other people, eat a low carb, good healthy diet on your Sunday. On Monday and Tuesday, compress your eating windows right down. Miss breakfast, miss lunch if you can. Have a wholesome low carbohydrate dinner. Eat till you're full, and do the same thing on the Tuesday. If you do that, then no matter where you start on the Sunday morning, you end up in quite deep nutritional ketosis. Your hunger goes, you're feeling good, the brain's operating well. And then, sort of keep it going the rest of the week with your normal meal frequency, but keep it low carb. And if it comes to Friday and Saturday and life and the socialism of life means that you have a few more carbs and you drop out of that nutritional ketosis, I think that's a more sustainable way to cycle between, having some growth and the anabolic effects of carbohydrate and fasting and the catabolic effects of not eating. In my view, you end up mimicking probably how humans have lived most of the time they've been on the planet, which is food was never stable.
Yes, I know it's a novel idea, isn't it? That there was a time in human history when people were hungry. And we should embrace it.
Absolutely, and the whole ketogenic nutritional ketosis system, to me, if you go to the local shopping mall and you go, okay, no one here has ever used that part of their energy system that has been a remarkable survival advantage for humans over the years, and it seems, just on the basis of pure curiosity, it'd be interesting to try and figure out how that works and how you feel on it. Even if you weren't planning on staying at it for a long time, I think that's an interesting thing to do.
Because there are different approaches to this have been popularised, haven't they? With the 5-2, where tell us some of the different forms, because this one you've come up with is kind of a more perhaps user-friendly, common sense one. What are some of the other ones that are out there? 5-2's one.
Well, I actually quite like 5-2. Mike Mosley's idea, the idea of, but what I don't like about it is, and I think he's improved in the latest version, is he says on your fasting days, eat 500 calories of anything, with whatever timing you like. I actually don't think that's a good idea. And if you're doing it by calories, you're more likely, just because you get more bulk, to go for carbs. So I think on the fasting days, you've got to get the carbs way down and limit the timing to compress the eating window. I do like the idea of cycling back that Mosley has, but just eating whatever you like on the other days, that's nonsense. But the structure of 2 days where you try really hard and the other days you might not be trying quite as hard, I don't mind that. There's the stuff, strangely, the stuff in the literature that's the most well published is alternate day fasting. And we've tried that in our lab. Bloody hell, it's hard. And in some of these trials, people do it for a year. I can't imagine. Frankly.
What about 16-8 or 18-6, where for 16 or 18 hours a day you don't eat and you have a window of eating and you keep the carbs low? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I don't mind that. I think the idea of compressed eating windows is a good one, and it seems to suit a lot of people quite well. With all these things, I think it's a matter of finding your ground for. I like some days of the week of severely restricting stuff and really pushing the nutritional ketosis, and other days just going back to normal frequency of eating, because at the end of the day, what's much more important is in eating is you will, because you're a human, you will fall off the horse. And if you just go, well, bugger it, that's the end of that, and you let yourself go and do whatever you want, that's the worst possible outcome. The best possible outcome is that you just climb straight back on and carry on. So whatever tool is going to help you do that is important. As I say, alternate day fasting, I couldn't do it. Every day restricted eating windows doesn't appeal to me, and when I do trials with it, people don't do quite as well. But some people do awesome on that, so more power to you.
And you've used the term a few times now, low carb. Let's define that for our listener, because when you look at the recommended daily intakes from the Dietitians Association, it's up around 350 grams of carbohydrates a day, and that's what's low carb.
Well, I think it's restricting carbohydrates to a point that there's because just take a step back. The brain doesn't need insulin to get glucose into the neurons in the brain, so the first 100 or so grams you eat will just go straight to the brain, and then that if there's enough to run the brain 100% on glucose, you won't have any pressure from the body to start to produce ketones and be better at burning fat. So it's the amount of restriction you need to not have the brain run 100% on glucose. Now, for some people that'd be 100 grams, for some people that'd be 150 grams, for some people that'd be 80 grams. Depends on how big they are, their activity level, that sort of thing. But it's in a practical sense, it means ditching pasta, rice, potatoes, and bread, because as soon as you start eating those in any quantities, you'll be straight over that threshold and no sort of low carb diet. And this is the thing that is annoying, that actually on pet things at the moment, just to slightly shift on, is there's been a spate of low carb diets are going to reduce your lifespan and kill you papers. And in none of those papers have they actually studied low carb diets. They've been talking about 40% of energy coming from carbohydrates as the lowest group. My mind that's not sensible.
Yeah, I actually recently went onto the USDA site, a guide for health practitioners, so that you can work out what to advise your patients. And I put in my height and my weight and my activity level, and the recommended level of carbohydrate intake was 400 to 525 grams of carb per day. So the USDA is still out there trying to sell grains.
Well, we did that for a bit of a laugh on the American College of Sports Medicine site when we had some really active athletes, and it was recommending that they had 900 grams a day. Yeah. So it's incredible, isn't it? Yeah, same sort of stuff. It's just
but getting back to what we started to talk about in this, and that is that for you or for I who are aware of this going on, we kind of can laugh about it and go, well, yes, of course the USDA is going to do that. They're trying to sell grains. But to an ordinary citizen who's looking for some advice, that's part of the confusion, isn't it?
Well, I think the most perverse form of that, I was just over in Queensland doing some talks in Gladstone, and I met a woman over there who's about my age, so she's just 50, maybe a bit younger, type 1 diabetic, and so she wasn't driving because she's of a retinopathy and lost sight of one eye. She's got kidney disease and neuropathy, and she's got this by following to the letter exactly what her endocrinologists and dietitians have told her to eat since she was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes when she was 8. So, there's no differentiation. So if you've got type 1 diabetes, then the same basic guidelines apply to you. Eat, 300 plus grams of carbohydrate a day. Of course, you can't control your blood glucose because of you never know exactly how much you've eaten, and you miss a bit. So you tend to run a bit high. She's run high blood sugar her whole life. And she's going to take 2 decades off her life. And you go back to your endocrinologist and they go, oh, yeah, you can't be doing what we told you because your numbers are too high. But they're going to be high. And type 1 diabetics are just a good example of how it's going to, it's just a more obvious example of how it's going to end than the standard dietary advice for everyone else. Yeah. If you do what you're told there, good luck.
Yes. Well, I know that I was on the Australian Diabetes Council site when they were celebrating their 75th anniversary, and they had a 10-step plan for living your life, and I think this was the key word, with diabetes, living your life with diabetes. And step number 1 was eat carbohydrates with every meal and stay on a low-fat diet. And you didn't have to read any other step along the way because you kind of knew if you followed step 1, you would be living your life with diabetes, even whether you wanted to or not.
Absolutely. And so for type 2 diabetes, which is, it's good evidence that's fully reversible now, at least it goes into a remission. So you haven't got any of the symptoms or markers of it, yet we treat it palliatively in modern medicine. And I mean, that's, I find that, beyond ethical.
Yes. You're part of a university, though, and there's medicine and nutrition taught at your university?
We don't have a medical school, but we teach nutrition. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, have you been able to, change the curriculum? I mean, you're in the Department of Public Health.
Yeah, I just changed my own curriculum. Of course, I'm going to change my curriculum.
Yeah, you're teaching, yeah, of course. No, I know you would. I know you would. But is that having an impact throughout the university? What your view of this nutrition is, or based on the science?
I think you come and go with that. Like, at some point you sort of go, I'm making no difference here whatsoever. And then someone will walk up to you and go, oh, we've done this. And, in the nursing department, we're now doing this and we're doing our diabetes clinics and we're doing low carb, which they actually are doing a community clinic, which is low carb. So I guess you sort of go, maybe that probably wouldn't have happened if myself and Karen Zinn, who's a dietitian who works with me, weren't there.
Yeah. Okay.
It's small ones, man.
Yeah. Okay. Now, listen, if people wanting to get started, and I mean, this is the beauty of fasting, it's hardly an expensive exercise, is it?
You save money.
Yeah. So what would be your 5 tips? People are saying, we're going to give this thing a go. What are your, say, 5 tips to people, or 4? You can do 3 or 4 or 5.
Number 1 is if you're not fat adapted, in other words, you haven't tried some sort of way of low carbohydrate eating, then fasting will hurt. You can do it, but I think you need an uncommon amount of willpower, and it will hurt in an uncommon way. So, I'd be at least having a few weeks on reducing the carbs down, because then you'll be twice as good at fat burning, and when you're not eating, you can just access fat. So that's number 1. Number 2 is, I think there's some preparation here involved. So, if you decide the fasting day is when you're doing your 8-year-old's birthday party, good luck with that, because so I prefer Monday and Tuesdays for my major fasting days, and simply because those are the days when I'm less exposed to the sight, smell, taste, look of random foods, and I'm busy at work and I can just carry on. So I think that's be prepared. And number 3 then translates into be busy on the days that you're fasting, because you actually will have extra time. If anyone if your listeners who've done a longer fast, like a 3-day fast, when you're not having any meals in a day, you sort of, this whole world of time opens up in front of you, and you're like, well, I'm obviously not going to work for 17 hours. I better go and do something else. So, get something else to do.
Yeah.
That's number 3.
Yeah.
Number 4, I think. To me, if you've got normal blood pressure, or you tend to be slightly on the low side, you could get hypotension, in other words, low blood pressure. So you'll stand up quickly and start to feel faint. And the remedy for that is extra salt. If you're on antihypertensives, then your blood pressure could plummet, because the insulin, this is the funniest thing, isn't it? Doctors going, well, don't be careful with fasting, especially if you're on hypertensives, because your blood pressure could plummet. It's like, well, goodness me, that's the whole point. Insulin itself is such a big controller of sodium balance and blood pressure that that's something to be very careful with. So that's people find it very hard to go, well, I have to eat extra salt now. They're told that's sort of going to give them high blood pressure and heart disease, but that's something to consider. And the 5th thing is, when you are eating, the great benefit of fasting, as I mentioned earlier, is that the food tastes really good. So be sure to enjoy those meals when you are eating. Don't behave like a complete lunatic. But I actually buy expensive food like fresh salmon and lots of vegetables, and sort of mix it all up into a nice sort of thing because I really want to savour it. And those are my 5 tips anyway.
Yeah. Listen, what about those? Now, people are hearing a lot about 3-day water fasts.
Yep.
What's the rationale behind that?
I guess that just you're really putting the system down to, if you're. Well, my view of the rationale is, and the reason I would recommend it if I were to, is we talked about earlier when, especially if you're insulin resistant, you get the signaling between insulin and glucagon that's gone AWOL, and one way to resolve that is to completely empty the liver and muscles out of glycogen, glucose, and it seems to sometimes resolve that signaling because this is a problem. You're on a low carb diet. You're a type 2 diabetic. You're trying so hard, and you take a blood glucose. You haven't eaten any carbs the whole day, and it's sitting at 8.9. You're like, how is this even possible? What sort of body have I got here? And you've got one where glucagon and insulin aren't acting in tandem. And I think one of the rationales for a longer fast is to help those two hormones to work in tandem better. I think that's one thing. The second thing is one to just give you a bit of a reset and a restart. I don't go much longer than 3 days myself, once or twice a year, because I find that it is a stress on the body, fasting, and you do release a lot of cortisol. Your sympathetic nervous system gets jacked up. I actually have trouble sleeping after about 3 days, and quality goes right down. And there may be evolutionary reasons for that. Maybe you just, if any food's going to walk past, then you're ready to grab it. Yeah. So 3 days fast. Yeah, yep. But interesting for people as well. Just also, I think if people have a sort of food addiction issue, sugar cravings, to be able to actually completely solve those, you could do that in 3 days, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned salt. You touched on it just for a moment, and I just got a little bit of a butterfly moment where I thought, I'm going to ask you, what about this? We'd talk about low salt, low salt, low salt. What do you think of that as a public health message?
Well, I think it's potentially dangerous. And there's a lot of debate around this at the moment when you look at all-cause mortality and sort of serum levels of sodium. The people with the lowest serum levels, in fact, the ones that the American Heart Association would recommend and below, have twice the death rate of everyone else. And there is an effect of higher sodium on mortality, but it's nowhere near as strong. I think the reality is that humans are quite well designed to, as are all other animals, to get to a homeostatic level of sodium in the body, and the only thing that dysregulates that is chronically high insulin. So, the solution's not sodium. The solution's in the sugar and the refined carbs, in my opinion. And there's some so interesting. Just back on the fasting and salt and blood pressure and that sort of thing. It was long known by the Germans that you'd put people with severe hypertension, non-responsive to medications, just put them on a 10-day hospital supervised fast, and you'd sort it out for good. I don't know, that seems extreme, but at least it sorts out, an extremely dangerous problem. So,
and are all salts created equally?
Well, I keep getting asked about that. What's that sort of iodized table salt? Do you need iodine? Well, I'm not sure what happens in Australia, but in New Zealand, about one person a year gets goiter. And then people go, well, it's the salt's from the Himalayas and it's got minerals in it. Well, that's what we've got in our house for one reason or another. I'm not sure if the Himalayas have got anything good to do with it, so we use that, but who knows.
Okay, now listen, just finally, Grant, I wanted to ask you, taking a step back from your position as a professor of public health, what do you think the biggest challenge is for people, for you as an individual, on your health journey through life in our modern world? What do you think that might be?
I just think you're constantly challenged with stuff that's good fun but not very good for you. For me personally, I really love salt and vinegar chips and beer. And don't judge me, but I like drinking beer, cold beer out of bottles, and salt and vinegar potato chips. I like doing that, but you can't keep doing that all the time because it's not that good for you. So how do you balance what keeps appearing right in front of your nose and what's good for you? look, if I just imagine, look, I'm really into this stuff, and I go into the supermarket, and I see at the aisle end, 3 king-size bars of chocolate, $5, and you're like, well, that would just be madness not to buy those. I should buy $10 worth because it's just good value. Not that I always do, but I mean, that's...
You mean you're human? Oh dear, Grant,
well,
this is a shock to me.
It's extraordinary to me that's in front of us the whole time, and I'm fighting those demons, so I can't imagine... I live and breathe this stuff. It's my mission in life to sort this stuff out. And I fight those demons, so I imagine everyone else does. And I think that's our challenge, which created a world that's quite good fun, but actually not that good for us.
That's great. Grant, thank you so much for joining me today. I've so enjoyed talking to you. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, mate.
So there it is, from a professor of public health himself. Why are messages so confusing? Public health messages. Well, medicine's slow to take on new information. 150 years for the limes. Wow. 10 years to wash your hands. I mean, really. That's a theme that Alan Savory talked about actually in an episode we did with him a few months ago on holistic management of, everything. He said, don't expect the change to come from above. It has to come from the ground up, from you and me. Another factor in public health messages, they set the bar very low. And finally, the vested interests, the role of the food, chemical and pharmaceutical industries in all levels of healthcare, from government policies, regulatory bodies, scientific research and journals, onto professional health organisations. I cover that in part 1 of my book, and we're going to be doing some webinars on this very subject in the near future. Grant mentioned several hunger hormones, and it just reminded me of how complex the balance of hormones in the body is. I was familiar with insulin, leptin, cortisol, ghrelin, and I remembered glucagon, only just. It's a hormone formed in the pancreas which promotes the breakdown of glycogen to glucose in the liver. But Incretin was one I needed to do more reading about. Look, I know I've said this before, but I learned so much on this podcast. I hope you do too. Incretin is a hormone that stimulates insulin secretion in response to meals. And the 2 most important incretin hormones are called GLP-1 and GIP. I'm not going to give you what that stands for. Let's not get too bogged down in detail. But there's other hormones. There's a lot of other hormones going on. Fasting is another big one, or calorie restriction. As Grant mentioned, working out what works for you is the key, as well as, if you're just starting, go on a low-carb diet first for a few weeks just to prepare. My wife and I have been doing 16-8 or 18-6. That is, we don't eat for 16 to 18 hours a day and then eat in the window of the 6 to 8 hours left. Now, for us, it's meant usually skipping breakfast, and like Grant, if you'd said to me 5 years ago this would be part of my life, I don't think I would have believed you. I, like Grant, and probably many of you, I love food. But the more I research it, and actually the more you think about it, it's just so obvious. When in human history did we eat as much as we do now? Never. Being able to cope with scarcity, go for periods regularly, where there was less food available, meant our bodies had to adapt, and they did for millions of years. Our modern overabundance of seemingly cheap food and never really being hungry, not really, is something that needs work. It needs to be a regular part of our lives, and the research is certainly bearing that out. We're going to be doing other shows on this very subject, and we have done with Cliff Harvey a few weeks ago. We've touched on it in our series with Thomas Seyfried and metabolic cancer as a metabolic disease, and with Dom D'Agostino. So I'm amazed, as is my wife, as how well we feel on this protocol. It's not a religion. We're not dogmatic about it. We do have breakfast 2 mornings a week sometimes, but we eat less on those days. We have both lost weight, made much more time in the morning for exercise, and thankfully for meditation. Give it a go. So much to think about. We'll have links, of course, to Grant's webpage and his terrific books, What the Fat, and his more recent offering, What the Fast. Incidentally, keep a lookout on my webpage. We've got some exciting things coming up. An ebook series which will be a guide to Unstress and Simply Be Well. There'll also be some short webinars on the very subject of confusing health messages and what a holistic approach to healthcare is all about. And we're going to be starting a new 5-week online course soon exploring the 5 pillars of health and wellness. So until next time, this is Dr. Ron Ehrlich. Be well. This podcast provides general information and discussion about medicine, health, and related subjects. The content is not intended and should not be construed as medical advice or as a substitute for care by a qualified medical practitioner. If you or any other person has a medical concern, he or she should consult with an appropriately qualified medical practitioner. Guests who speak in this podcast